A few years ago, in a small conference room in a university in the Pacific Northwest, a group of indigenous elders and a group of population geneticists sat down across a table from each other and talked for several hours about the past. The geneticists had laptops. They had pulled up phylogenetic trees with branch points labeled by years before present. They had ready, in shareable form, a summary of every major ancient DNA study of the Americas conducted over the past 15 years. The Anzac Child in Montana, the Upward Sun River infants in Alaska, the Trail Creek children, Kennewick Man, the Hoyo Negro Girl, the Lagoa Santa series, the Population Y signal, the ancient Beringian lineage, the timing of the standstill, the timing of the southward expansion. Every paper, every date, every divergence estimate. The elders had stories. Their stories had been told in their families and their nations for as far back as anyone could measure. The stories described emergence places, migration places, rivermouth places, sky places, ice places. The stories did not need confirmation from the geneticists. The stories had their own integrity. But the elders were curious. They wanted to hear what the cells were saying. And the geneticists, in the best tradition of the work as it now exists, when it exists at its best, wanted to listen. The afternoon went on for a long time. There was disagreement on details. There was agreement on the deepest thing of all, which was that the peoples of the Americas had been here for a very long time, that they were related to each other, and that their kinship was older and stranger than any textbook had managed to convey. That conversation is, in some ways, where we are now in the long sweep of what the DNA has revealed about the first peoples of the Americas. We are in the moment when the genetic record has finally caught up with what indigenous traditions have been saying, and when both records, the molecular one and the storied one, are starting, with care and respect, to be read together rather than against each other. What the DNA has revealed is, at its core, four big things. First, it has revealed the depth. The first peoples of the Americas have been here, by every line of genetic evidence, and now by some of the archaeological evidence as well, for somewhere between 16 and 25,000 years. The window keeps stretching. The lower bound used to be 14,000. Then it moved to 15, then 16. Now, with the White Sands footprints and the genetic divergence estimates, the upper end has reached 23 and possibly 25,000. The depth of human presence in this hemisphere is now firmly established at a scale that, only a few decades ago, the orthodox view of the field would have flatly denied. Second, it has revealed the unity. Every one of the oldest American genomes traces, at its deepest level, to a single founding population that paused in Beringia during the late Pleistocene. The Anzac Child, the Upward Sun River infants, Kennewick Man, the Hoyo Negro Girl, the Lapa do Santo individuals. All of them, regardless of where on the continent they were buried, regardless of how their cultures or languages eventually diversified, share that common origin. The peoples of the Americas are, in the most literal and least sentimental sense, kin to one another. The continental diversity that the colonial moment encountered grew out of a shared deep root. Third, it has revealed the layers. That kinship is not simple. The founding population itself was a blend of at least two earlier deep lineages, an East Asian-derived component and an ancient North Eurasian component represented by the Malta Boy at Lake Baikal. Within the Americas, the founders diversified into multiple branches: the ancient Beringians, the northern Native Americans, the southern Native Americans. A faint additional signal from a population related to Australasians, Population Y, contributes a small amount of ancestry to certain southern populations. Later movements, including the spread of Eskimo Aleut and Athabascan-speaking groups from northern sources around 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, added further layers to the populations of the far north. Identity is built in strata. The cells remember them all. Fourth, it has revealed the dignity of the ongoing presence. The peoples whose ancestors paused in Beringia for thousands of years, who walked down a coast and across a continent, who buried their children with ochre and stone tools, who told stories of where they came from in languages that the colonizers tried to extinguish. Those peoples are still here. Their nations are still here. their cosmologies are still here. The DNA does not turn them into a closed historical case. It opens a window onto their depth, but the present they are living is not in a museum. It is on the lands they have always lived on, in the streets of every American city, in the courts where indigenous water rights are being argued, in the schools where indigenous languages are being revived, in the ceremonies that continue at the right times of year. What changes then when we say the DNA changes everything? It is not that the science has overturned indigenous knowledge. It has not. The traditions that placed the peoples of the Americas in these landscapes since the beginning were not wrong. They were the way the truth had been carried in a different form. The DNA confirms a deep presence. The traditions tell us how that presence was lived. The two are not in competition. The framing of the past decade has been a slow, often awkward shift from one in which scientists discovered the past of indigenous peoples to one in which indigenous peoples and scientists collaboratively bring different tools to a shared question. The science is better when it is done this way. The respect is more durable. The results are more honest. What changes in the textbook sense is the picture we hand to children in schools. The mental image of a single wave of Asians trudging through an ice corridor 13,000 years ago and becoming Indians is simply wrong. The actual picture is more interesting. A small, ancient population entering Beringia during the last glacial maximum. A pause of thousands of years in a homeland that no longer exists. A diversification in place. A series of southward movements. Some of them very early and small, others later and larger, mostly along the Pacific coast and possibly through later inland routes. A continuing layering of contributions from related Asian and Siberian populations. A diversification across two continents that produced hundreds of distinct nations, languages and cosmologies. A continued presence into the present, despite 5 centuries of attempted destruction. What changes in the political sense is the moral force of the indigenous claim. The peoples whose ancestors have been in these landscapes for 16 to 25,000 years cannot be reasonably described as latecomers. They cannot be reduced to tribes in some diminutive, anthropological sense that places them outside the universal human story. They are the oldest continuous human presence in 2/3 of the world's habitable surface. Their right to their lands, their waters, their languages, their cultural integrity is not a claim that can be brushed aside by appeals to abstract notions of progress or development. The DNA, by the simple weight of its depth, has reinforced what indigenous nations have been arguing for centuries in their own terms. What changes, in the scientific sense, is the way the next generation of work will be done. The era of grave-robbing science is, finally, ending. The model of collaboration, where tribal councils and indigenous communities are full partners in research design, sample handling, publication, and repatriation, is becoming the standard for ancient DNA work in the Americas. There will still be debates. There will still be conflicts over which methods are appropriate and what kinds of questions can be asked. But the foundational principle that the past of indigenous peoples belongs to indigenous peoples and that science is a guest has gained real ground. There are also, of course, things we still do not know. We do not know with confidence the precise timing of the first entry into the Americas. We do not know exactly what routes the earliest arrivals took. We do not know who the population Y-source population was or where they came from. We do not know whether the ancient Beringian lineage left any modern descendants at all, or whether they are entirely extinct. We do not know how the deep diversification within the Beringian standstill happened, whether it was driven by isolation, by selection, by drift, by some combination of all three. The picture is in better focus than it was 20 years ago, but it is still, by historical standards, low resolution. What will the next 10 years bring? Probably more genomes from sites we have not yet excavated. Probably more dates from sites we have already dug. Probably more refinement of the timing and the layering. Almost certainly more surprises. Populations we did not know about. Lineages that turn out to have left small signals we missed. Ghost ancestries that take their place beside population Y. The field is one of the most active in all of archaeology, and it is being practiced now with a partnership ethic that, while imperfect, is far better than what existed in the past. What stays the same, beneath all the changes, is the human reality at the center of it all. People walked across a land that no longer exists. They lived in it for a very long time. They split into branches. Some of those branches walked further south than any human population had ever walked before, and reached the southernmost tip of South America before any pyramid had been built anywhere on Earth. They invented agriculture 3 times independently. They built cities in deserts, and rainforests and mountain ranges, and along Great Lake systems. They developed cosmologies of astonishing precision and beauty. They were almost destroyed by a colonial encounter that brought disease and violence and theft on a scale that is hard to fully take in. And they survived. They survived. Their descendants are alive in every country in both Americas. They speak hundreds of living languages. They continue to govern themselves in nations both recognized and not recognized by the settler states that overlay their territories. They continue to know things about their lands that nobody else knows. The DNA is, in the end, a way of saying what was already true. The first peoples were not first in the sense of being primitive. They were first in the sense of being here longest, of carrying the deepest and richest record of human adaptation to 2 hemispheres, of having lived a story that no other people on Earth can claim, of having watched the Pleistocene world end, and the Holocene begin, and the modern world come crashing in, and of having continued, through all of it, to be themselves. The conversation in that small conference room in the Pacific Northwest ended with quiet. The elders went home to their families. The geneticists went back to their labs. The data are now in the published record. The traditions are now, as they have always been, in the keeping of the people who tell them. The work in both forms continues. The story has not changed in any of the ways that matter. The peoples of the Americas were here. They are here. The DNA is one more way the world has learned to listen to that fact. And the listening, at last, is the right way around. Not science discovering indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples allowing science, when invited, to add a chapter to a book they are still authoring. There is one more thing the DNA has revealed, and it is perhaps the most important of all. It has revealed that the project of trying to draw a line between us and them in the deep human past is a project that does not survive contact with the evidence. The people who walked across Beringia were not a separate kind of human being. They were us. They thought what we think. They loved what we love. They feared what we fear. They buried their children when they had to, with the same care and grief that we would have if we had to. The cells in their bodies were the cells in ours. The genetic record, when read carefully and humbly, does not produce alien ancestors. It produces relatives. It produces, across time and across continents, kin. The first peoples of the Americas are the deepest record of human persistence and adaptation in 2 hemispheres. They are also, in a way that the DNA makes harder to deny than ever, a part of the same family that every human being on the planet belongs to. Their depth in this land does not make them less human. It makes them more rooted, more present, more worthy of the respect that any deep-rooted people deserves. And the descendants of that journey, who walked it from a drowned continent to 100 different ecologies and built 100 different ways of being human in this hemisphere, are the inheritors not just of land and language and ceremony, but of the original demonstration that humans can adapt, can survive, can become themselves in any climate, on any coast, in any forest the world can hand them. Right outside the conference room window, the sun was setting over the Salish Sea. The light hit the water in a long, slow gold. The salmon were running. The cedars stood. The world was working as it has worked for thousands of years. Everything had changed, and nothing had.